So it's a huge pleasure to be able to welcome here today Jane Elliott, who is the head of the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. She's going to talk a little bit about what we have already learned from them and about the future also of longitudinal studies and where we're going. We're going to have a bit of time for questions and answers and discussion after that. So without any further ado, thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here on this lovely, warm, sunny day. And what I want to do is keep this fairly informal and interactive, even though we're not round a table and there's quite a lot of us. So I'll try and pause a couple of times and encourage people to ask questions. I'm aware that there are people here from a very wide range of different groups and interest groups and disciplinary perspectives. I'm going to give a fairly general talk, and what I'm hoping is I will whet your appetite and that people can get in touch with us afterwards if they want to follow things up in more detail. So you'll see my sort of main objectives for this lunchtime talk are to give an overview of the value of longitudinal data for policy. I'm very specifically going to focus on the 3 enormous birth cohort studies that we manage at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. I'll give you a couple of examples of how these studies have influenced policy, but I really can't do justice to the wealth of the data that we've got. I've also got a couple of slides at the end where I can talk a bit more generally about other longitudinal sources of data, other major longitudinal surveys in Britain. So if you want to ask questions about that, that's fine. I'm aware of those outside of our own centre. And also just to encourage, I realise some people in the room actually will like to get their hands on a real data set, so I want to say a little bit about how you go further and actually get the data. And I mean, as I said, what I was hoping was that this would be more of a sort of informal discussion forum, because at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies we really want to hear more about how the data could be useful. And this is a really good time for people to engage with the cohort studies, because we're just leading up to the next sweeps of the Millennium Cohort study and the 1958 and the 1970 studies. So we're engaged in a whole lot of consultation with potential users to find out what people would most like us to ask. So it's a very good time to engage with us if you want to help shape the direction of the studies. Can everybody hear me all right? Because it's a bit noisy with the fans, but yeah, good. So to start off with sort of generally, what is the value of longitudinal data? And as Neil has already hinted, it really enables us to get a lot closer to understanding causal effects. One of the problems clearly with the social sciences is that we can't do experiments on people very easily. Some of my early work, for example, was on the impact of divorce on adults and children. And we couldn't tell couples to get divorced because they were in the experimental group and then find out what impact it had on their children. But we used the 1958 study because it enabled us to look at children's development both before and after the divorce. So we've got the sort of benefit of hindsight because we've got a longitudinal study. We can look at children's trajectories over that period of divorce, which largely confirmed that there was an impact of divorce, but that it wasn't perhaps as severe as some people had thought, because you've got selection effects, that you've got children from very disadvantaged families were the ones most likely to experience parental divorce. So that's a sort of example of how you might start looking at causality using longitudinal data. Another major thing about longitudinal data is it's not the same as time series data. We're not talking here about studies like the British Social Attitude Survey. That might seem longitudinal because it's a long-running study and we get sort of figures in the press about how people's attitudes are changing. But that's a repeated cross-sectional study. So all that can tell us is en masse how people's attitudes are changing. It won't tell you whether Mr. Smith has changed his attitudes over time. It just tells you generally how the population's attitudes are changing. So longitudinal data where we're following up cohorts or panels, we keep going back to the same individuals, we give them a unique identifier so that we can link their responses over time, and we can then look at individual trajectories to see how people's attitudes are changing, but also things like, you know, their fertility experiences, moving in and out of relationships, and all sorts of different aspects of their lives. And perhaps a sort of more technical issue is our ability then to also look at duration effects and see how time might have an impact on individuals. By this I'm talking about the time in a particular state, like how long people have been unemployed or how long someone's been a lone parent, and whether it's not just the state you're in, but actually the duration that you've been in that state that might have an influence on outcomes. So that's a sort of general overview to why we might be interested in longitudinal data rather than cross-sectional data. I want to move on and give you the examples of the British birth cohort studies. Britain is unique in the world in having such a treasury of data. It was paediatricians in the 40s and 50s that we've got to be really grateful to who started these studies, which mean that now we've got this fantastic resource that look back over the whole of people's lives. So the original two studies, the 1946 and the 1958 studies, were set up to look at perinatal mortality. So it was the time that the National Health Service was being set up, and they were very concerned about the health of babies and mothers. That meant that they started a study that brought together health records, interviews with mothers, and also social science data to try and understand more about social disadvantage and health around childbirth. Then they realised what a fantastic resource they'd got, and these studies became longitudinal. So the 1946 study is looked after at University College London and is funded by the Medical Research Council. At the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, we look after the 58, the 70 and the Millennium Cohort studies. You can see there's a large gap between the 1970 and the Millennium Cohort, so 30 years when we've got rather less information about development. Someone was asking me earlier about the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children. So that's another longitudinal study, but just based around the Avon region, starting in 1992. So what distinguishes these is that they're national studies. And that's what makes us the envy of the world, is that we've got these birth cohort studies that are nationally representative. And there are very clear plans for a 2012 study, which again would be quite medically focused, looking a lot at perinatal health. But we haven't yet heard whether that's definitely being funded or not. That's going to be headed up by Carol Deserter at the Institute of Child Health if it does get funding. So what I was going to do is sort of talk you through the design of the 1958 cohort, because that will give you a good insight into both the 1958 and the 1970 studies. So an enormous sample of over 17,000 children. People sometimes ask me if I work on that 7-Up study. 7-Up was 25 children and this is 17,000. So although they've got nice footage of children, this is a bit different. And although we say it's nationally representative, my very poor joke is it's not really, because they were all born in 1 week, so they're all Pisces. So we can't do analysis of birth signs and how it impacts on you. And the sample was followed at these ages, and you'll see that there doesn't seem to be very much logic in the ages at which children were followed and then people followed in adult life. And that's because there hasn't been very secure funding for the study until more recently. And so it was very much of happenstance when funding was available. And the age 7 study, for example, came out of the Plowden Committee in the 1960s, realising that they wanted to do a whole review of primary education, but didn't have the evidence base on which to base that. So they apparently rang up the people who'd done the 1958 perinatal mortality study and said, if we give you £200,000, can you do us a study in the next 18 months? And that's how it became a longitudinal study. So very much started off with this policy focus. Now we're planning to go back to people every 4 or 5 years. So the 1958 study, we're planning to do a telephone survey with them when they're aged 55. We started off with 17,000. About 1,500 of those individuals have already died, many of them in childhood, many sort of very close to birth, and about another 1,500 of them have emigrated. So we have a sort of maximum target sample of about 14,000, and we've managed to stay in touch with about 10,000 individuals who are still very willing to be part of the study. So still a very large sample. And the data we collect tends to be very quantitative and structured to enable us to do statistical analyses. But most recently, at age 50, we did some qualitative interviews with a subsample of 170 cohort members, so that we've got individuals' own sort of perspectives on their life, their retrospective biographical accounts. Now this gives you a sort of diagrammatic representation of what's gone into the study over the years, and you can see on the left-hand side, starting off with over 17,000 individuals, and then the number we've got now at about 10,000. But this highlights the value of these prospective longitudinal studies and why we can't just ask about people's lives in retrospect. Because you'll see that in childhood, it was possible to collect data not just from the child, but to also collect data from the parents, from the school teacher, and for there to be medical examinations of the children. So we've got really detailed triangulated data on children's development, which we're then able to map to the adult data and see how childhood might impact on later life. And that's clearly something that you couldn't do if you were just asking people to retrospectively give you information about their lives. To give you an indication of the sort of broad range of data that we collect, I've just given you a sort of list of the summary headings from the age 50 survey. And you can see that there are some very sort of standard things that we ask about, like household composition. So we ask who's in the household, who's left the household, who's joined the household. We've also got a whole lot of information about people's employment and their employment transitions. So when we go back every 4 or 5 years, we ask people to remember the last time that they were interviewed and to tell us about each important transition they've made since then. So we've got the dates of any moves between jobs, promotions. We've also got things like when children were born, whether people have divorced, started a new cohabitation. So really a very detailed chronicle of what's happened in individuals' lives. To some extent, we go back and ask the same questions every 4 or 5 years to make sure that we've got comparability. So for example, we use the same sort of questions on well-being so that we can track levels of anxiety and depression over the life course. But there are some questions which are very specific to the stage that people are at. So for example, at age 50, we ask questions for the first time based on pensions and attitudes to retirement, asked women questions about their experience of menopausal symptoms, and we also, for the first time since childhood, did little assessments on cohort members and got people to do memory and concentration tasks. And the idea is that at age 50, it's a good time to take baseline data so that we can then look at people's trajectories of capability going into older age. And in a way, you could see this sort of age 50 survey as looking in both directions. You might be interested in where people have got to at age 50 and how earlier life predicts your well-being and your financial status at 50. The other way of looking at it, of course, is that 50 is a starting point, which is what something like the English Longitudinal Study of Aging would do, and to collect data because you're interested in aging profiles. So what we have to think about when we're deciding what to ask in any new sweep is keeping that forward-looking and backward-looking perspective so that we collect data that's valuable for people to use. So just as a snapshot of some of the results from that study, I just thought I'd focus on the pensions and retirement, because I also wanted to highlight that we try and make sure we use questions that have been used in other studies. So before we did the age 50 study, we talked to people at the Department of Work and Pensions about questions they'd asked, and we borrowed some of their questions from the pension survey. So this was reported a couple of weeks ago in a place like the Financial Times, and we've got a working paper on the CLS website that describes this work in more detail. But I think what was interesting was a sort of headline finding of almost 90% of cohort members saying that they'd be prepared to carry on doing paid employment after state retirement age if it meant that they'd have a better standard of living. And also nearly 3/4 of them saying that they worry about how much they'll have to live on when they retire. Now clearly with sort of ageing demographic population, we need to be very aware of people's planning for the future. And again, there are two ways of taking this data. One is to look at what predicts people's attitudes at age 50. The other is to start with these attitudes at 50 and see how it then predicts people's later employment transitions and attachment to the labour market. So what sort of research questions are best addressed by this sort of data? Well, what it's really good at is providing us with insights into how very early life has impacted on later life. So things like how transitions from school into the labour market might now be having an impact on people much later on in their working life. And I've written elsewhere about how we might think of cohort studies as being narrative in nature. And by that I meant that firstly, you can tell stories about individuals' lives, but stories that actually mean something because they're based on statistical data. So you have that sort of sense of a beginning, a middle and an end, that we're interested in predicting where people are now. But also, a good narrative has an orientation. You say where it happened and when it happened. And if we use the cohort studies properly, we can bring in historical contextual information about things like the state of the labour market and the school system that different cohorts of individuals went through. So one of the strong things about cohorts as well is being able to make comparisons between cohorts. So we can look at links between social change and changing experiences of the different cohorts that we've got. But as well as looking at the sort of very long-term impact of early life on later life, the other thing is just within adult life, for example, being able to see how different life domains impact on each other. So I've done work in the past with people like Heather Joshi and Shirley Dex, looking at women's employment transitions around the birth of children. So there we've got people's their fertility histories and their employment histories, and we can look at the two together and see how they mutually reinforce or impact on each other. So I'll just give you a sort of checklist here of some of the sort of variety of things that the cohorts have been used for. And I think it's worth pointing out that we have every year literally hundreds of researchers who use data from the cohort studies. But they are such a rich resource that there's room for hundreds more. And that's why I'm very pleased to do this sort of talk, because I'm keen to encourage people to do research using the data and to commission research using the data. So you can see here a very wide range of different types of things that the cohort studies, particularly the older studies, have been used for. So one of the sort of early findings was the health impact of smoking in pregnancy on the later development of the child. And so the 1958 study was one of the key studies that contributed to the warning that's on cigarette packets now about pregnant women, it being dangerous for them to smoke. But as well as sort of health, we've got issues around employment, where I think we've got very detailed information, maternal employment and outcomes for children. So as well as having data on individuals and individual trajectories, we've also got intergenerational information, because when the cohort were young, data was collected on their parents, and as the cohort members themselves have had children, then we've got some information as well about their children's development. So we can actually look at these sort of intergenerational impacts as well. And here are some of the sort of more recent contributions to policy. So the Gordon Brown baby bond, which I know is under question now, that was something that came out of the cohort studies, looking at the sort of resources that individuals had at age 23 and how that impacted on their life in sort of their mid-30s. And issues around things like women and pensions. What I haven't put here is as well the work on divorce, very much impacted on trying to develop more of sort of mediation service to make sure that parents who are divorcing had a sort of more neutral place to go and talk about their conflicts rather than just using solicitors. And a lot of those initiatives came out of the findings that showed that divorce had such a negative impact on children. So that's a very sort of general overview. But I wanted to just give you a sort of case study of a very recent publication, or not even a publication yet. This has been submitted to the Lancet. It's work that's been done by a colleague of mine, Dylan Neal, and Chris Bonnell. And I like this because it's got a very policy focus to the analysis. So you can see from the title it's about the distribution of the risk of teenage parenthood. But what they were interested to do in this study was to see how possible it is to target the individuals who are most at risk of teenage pregnancy and teenage parenthood. So the sort of policy question in a way is, are we better off putting our interventions out to all teenagers, or should we actually focus resources on an identifiable smaller group of individuals that we think are much more at risk of teenage parenthood? And so the study used the 1970 cohort study, which has got detailed information on people at age 10 and 16, both from the cohort member themselves, but also from their family and sort of community that they live in, to find out more about which factors increase the risk of teenage, particularly motherhood, but also to see how easy it is, whether you miss people when you sort of create a risk score. And there's some sort of broad descriptive findings, so about 10% of the women in this study reported teenage motherhood, and there's a list here of the risk factors, which probably aren't very surprising, things like living in social housing, but also things like your parents having low expectations for how long you're going to stay on at school. And this is the sort of detailed information that we've got in the cohort studies that wouldn't be available in other data sets. But what was interesting about this study is it found that even when you put together all those different factors and create a composite risk score, it was quite difficult to identify all the teenage mothers. So contrary to what you might expect from this sort of idea of social exclusion, it wasn't easy to target specific groups. So it was only about 2/3 of people could be identified, which suggests that we might want to have sort of more inclusive interventions and education for all teenagers rather than focusing it in specific areas or on specific groups. So I was going to move on and talk about the Millennium Cohort study because it's a much more recent study, but I think I'll just pause there and see if people have got questions so far on the 58 and the 70 or on longitudinal data in general.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, Joe. It's Lee Elliott from the Sutton Trust here. So I'm a director of research, use the longitudinal studies a lot. We're involved in that intergenerational mobility comparison, which was very influential. I suppose it's just a caveat with all this that I always see cohort studies as playing a part in the evidence base and not being the sole source of evidence. The reason I say that is that they can't show you everything. So I would say you need evaluations of policies as well. So see if something works. And I think one of the big gaps in our knowledge is not just the 1980 cohort study that didn't happen, for example, but also why policies haven't been evaluated. So I think we just have to be a bit careful. And I'm a big fan of cohort studies, but they don't tell you why some things happen, and you have to be so careful with causality and correlation. So we try and be careful when we publish results from the studies, but often they'll get taken up as causation. So I don't want to be too negative, but I was a big fan. But I just think you have to put that into context.
Yeah. So to briefly respond to that, I completely agree with you. I mean, I'm talking today about the cohort studies, but I agree that you need other sorts of studies. But sometimes the cohorts can also be used as control groups. So it can be very useful when doing an evaluation to have a broader representative sample. So for example, the evaluation of Sure Start, I know, has used the Millennium Cohort study children as a sort of benchmark. And because the Millennium Cohort is clustered in particular areas, and particularly looking at areas where there's high numbers of people living in disadvantage and lots of ethnic minority groups, it's been possible to use the Millennium Cohort as a control. So there's been new data, which is much more sort of evaluative of Sure Start, collected and then compared with the cohort. Another very different example is the 58 study, where we've actually got their DNA, and they've been used as case controls by the Wellcome Trust, so looking at groups with a particular disease and then using the cohort study as a group that's known not to have the disease. It can also be really useful if people are planning a study, just to get a broad sense of how many people there are in different groups. So it can be a resource in a number of different ways. But I agree, we shouldn't just fund the cohort studies and shut up shop elsewhere.
I wondered if the banks had come to you for advice on what kind of people are most likely not to be able to repay their loans and mortgages. And if the banks haven't come to you yet, do you think you can help them if they did?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. The easy answer is that no, the banks haven't come to us. We don't have very fine-grained information about people's economics. We ask people about their income. We don't have as much information about their assets and wealth. And there are other longitudinal studies that do that. So the Wealth and Assets Survey, which DWP sponsor, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, which is run by economists and has much more focus on people's economics. So I think this also shows how different studies complement each other, and some have more detail than others.
Manuela from the Independent Schools Council. I was just wondering, you said that apart from all the children with Pisces, it was representative, but how did you actually choose participants? Whether you said the Millennium Studies clustered in certain areas, and how do you make sure that you're representative of actually the UK population?
Okay, really good question. So the 1958 and 1970 studies are very odd samples because it was everybody born in 1 week. So it's not like a normal sort of sample survey, because it really was everybody in that week. And the reason it was done that way was it wasn't professional interviewers that collected the data, it was health visitors. And so it was very much sort of top-down approach that health visitors were told, you will be collecting this data, and it was manageable by doing it for a very sort of short period of time. The Millennium Cohort study, which I was going to come on and talk about, is a very different design where people have been sampled throughout the whole year, because joking apart, it is important to know what season of the year different children were born in, both sort of in terms of their health, but also thinking about transitions into education and whether it matters whether you're old for your year or young for your year. And it was a clustered sample. There's lots more information on the website. I won't give huge detail now, but the sample was clustered to make sure that there were more than you'd expect of minority ethnic groups and disadvantaged groups, and also oversampling in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, so that there are then weights that can be applied if you want to come up with statistics that represent the whole of the nation. That's one way of doing it. But if you're wanting to make comparisons, you want to make sure you've got enough in the different groups, so then you'd use a different weighting procedure to make sure that you can make those comparisons. If we maybe have one more question, and then I'll carry on and we can have some more questions.
Hi, it's Aaron Fairweather from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. I was interested in what you were saying about employment transitions. We're quite interested in how people use different forms of work during their working life. So maybe a full-time employee, part-time, maybe become sort of an entrepreneur for a while, maybe do some temporary work. Do you pick up that level of potentially even very short-term work that people may have done?
Yes, we've got really fabulous employment data. So whereas we probably don't ask as much as we might do about people's finances, we ask them retrospectively over the last 4 years to let us know every employment transition they've made. And so we've got things like whether they're self-employed, the hours they were working, whether they've been promoted. So yes, we've got complete work histories on people that enable you to look at those transitions. Where it won't be so good is if you've got people with very complicated employment. If someone was holding down 3 jobs at once, we do try and capture that, but you can imagine somebody who's really doing lots and lots of casual work is unlikely to give every detail of that over the last 4 years. So they are asked, but it's whether they sort of edit out some of the sort of briefer periods of employment. But the sort of benchmark we use is anything over a month that we ask about. So I think I might carry on, and then we can have more time for discussion and questions at the end. So I think it's worth contrasting the older studies with the Millennium Cohort study. So a similar sort of sample size at the beginning with over 19,000 children. As I said, born over the whole of a year rather than being focused in a specific week. And rather than being looked at birth, they were contacted when the babies were 9 months. And the other difference from the older cohorts is there's been much more of a recognition of the role of fathers in the development of children. So in the 58 and the 70 studies, really the main respondent was almost always the mother, but there's actually separate questions asked of mothers and fathers at 9 months, 3 years, 5 years and 7 years. And the 7-year data is now available and in the archive, and as I say, we're planning for the age 11 sweep. And The Millennium Cohort is core funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, but it also receives quite a lot of funding from government departments like DWP, Department of Health, Education, and very much the aim is to make sure that it is policy relevant. But this is where Lee's question is a good one about, well, surely we need evaluations as well. The important thing about these studies, I think, is to make sure they're policy relevant but not obsessively policy driven, because policy can be very short term, and we need to make sure that these are enduring scientific resources that can be used much more in the longer term. So it's very much an attempt to make sure that they remain multi-purpose studies and look at every aspect of individuals' lives. So at a glance, this gives you a sense of the sort of data that's been collected so far at these 4 different time intervals. And you can also see this is a much more detailed study than was possible in the 1958 or the 1970 study. The children have been looked at much more regularly through childhood. And here's another sort of representation of the sorts of data that's being collected. So you can see we've got cognitive assessments on the children at age 3, age 5 and age 7. So possible to start looking at trajectories there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then also some physical measurements, so basic anthropometry, but also some interesting sub-studies. So for example, we've asked children to wear an accelerometer at age 7, so that we've got very detailed information over a week of how much exercise children have had. And this sort of shows how studies change over time. That, of course, now we're very concerned with obesity and the number of children that are obese. That's something that wasn't thought about as much with the 1958 and the 1970 studies. So there would be just very broad questions asked about exercise, but here we're collecting much better observational data. And again, that's something that can only be collected, obviously, prospectively. You need this sort of study where you're tracking people through time to be able to collect that data. So I now wanted to just sort of showcase how some work that had been done with the 1970 cohort is now being replicated using the Millennium Cohort, so that you can see the way that we can compare cohorts but also look at individual trajectories. So many people will already be aware, I think, of the Feinstein research. And Leon developed an index looking at the development of children, and this was based on the 1970 study, and a subgroup of the 1970 were actually studied at 22 months and 42 months, and the whole cohort was looked at 5 years and 10 years. And the overall finding of this research was that it was those children with wealthy or educated parents, even if they had very poor early scores, seemed to catch up, whereas the children who seemed to be doing really well very early in life but had poor backgrounds, then seem to decline. And this is the sort of classic graph that I think many people have seen, because it's reproduced in lots of places, including things like Every Child Matters. And you can very clearly here see these two groups. So starting off in this sort of top 10%, this is the top sort of ability range. But whereas the richer children, the children from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds, sort of maintain that advantage, those who are doing really well at age 22 months but are from poorer backgrounds, you can see them declining. And you can see this sort of crossover point, and this is a bit theoretical because data wasn't collected at 6 years, but at about 6 years you see this crossover. Now, you might say, yeah, that's all very fascinating, but this data is pretty old now. I mean, it's a really nice research design, and it shows us what we can do with cohort data. But clearly we're talking here about 1970 to 1980. Whereas now, of course, with the Millennium Cohort study, we can start reproducing that sort of analysis. And Joe Blandon and Steve Machin have used data from all 3 cohort studies, but they're using the Millennium Cohort study to try and replicate that analysis. And they're finding broadly similar results. They've only got the age 3 to age 5 data so far, and they're now processing the age 7 data. But if we look at this graph just showing again the sort of trajectories going from 3 to 5, you can see here they've actually got 3 groups. So they've got the high income, the middle income and the low income. And again, you can see a similar sort of story emerging to the Feinstein story. So that if you're doing really well at age 3, if you've got rich parents, you're likely to maintain that advantage, but you can see this steeper gradient declining for those where there's low income. and a sort of mirror image of that when you look at the children that are doing less well at age 3. So this demonstrates how we can reproduce findings or test out findings from one cohort and see whether they're maintained in another cohort. And again, looking at the Millennium Cohort study and just presenting some recent findings. This is Kath Kiernan and Fiona Mensa, and what they've been interested in doing is looking at how family trajectories in terms of marital status between birth and age 5, how that might be associated with both parent and child well-being. And the reason I wanted to show you this was, again, because it shows the importance of having longitudinal data and looking at trajectories and change over time. Now this is quite a busy graph, so I'll talk you through it. You've basically got 3 groups here. So on the far left-hand side, you've got those who were married, where the parents were married at birth. And then there are sort of 5 different pathways that those groups, 4 different pathways that those groups could take. So either their parents are still together, it's a stable family at age 5, or there's been some separation, so periods apart by age 5, or the parents have split and the mother's on her own when the child's 5, or there's a new partner. So that's the ones that were married at birth. Then in the middle here we have those families where parents were cohabiting at birth, and on the far right hand side we can see those where the mother was on her own at birth. So you can see there it's possible to look in quite a lot of detail at different trajectories, and the blue line there is family poverty and the red line is maternal depression. And so the sort of green light goes to people where they were married at birth and the parents are still together, because you've got low rates of family poverty and low rates of maternal depression. Another green light goes if you're cohabiting when your child is born and you're still stable, cohabiting but still together at age 5, or you've got married when your child is 5. But then the red light, so the danger signals, are where the mother was on her own and she's still on her own when the child's 5, or she's been in and out of partnerships. And that's particularly true, you can see, for family poverty, where there are problems there. So there's a lot of information packed into that graph, but I hope you can see how it enables you not just to look at someone's current circumstances, but to see how different trajectories might impact on outcomes. So moving to think a bit about plans for the future, we've got funding for the next 5 years at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and that's to include 3 new sweeps of data collection. So the plan is to go to the Millennium Cohort study children in year 6, so their final year at primary school when they're 11, and there's a consultative conference about that on the 21st of July. So if people want to follow this up more, then look on our website, it's free to register, and you might want to come and be part of that and hear more about the plans and also contribute to planning that study. The next sweep of the 1970 cohort will be when cohort members are 42, so really sort of peak of their adult life. You know, you are in your prime in your mid-40s, I'd like to say. And there'll be a consultation about that in the autumn, and that will be a face-to-face study. And then we've just got funding for a telephone survey of the 1958 cohort, and that will be in 2013. So I was going to move on and talk a bit more about other longitudinal resources, but perhaps we should stop there and invite some more questions and points for discussion.
Steve Sismo from Picker Institute in Oxford. I was interested in the Feinstein Index. Was that specifically developed with a view to being predictive? I.e., did you use the end result in order to develop the measure, or was it developed before you knew the end result, before they knew the end result?
So it would have been developed before they knew the end result, because the data was collected at 22 months, and so a whole lot of different data was collected. And then Feinstein did things like principal components analysis to try and find, rather than having lots of different scores, to find a sort of single dimension that represented the child's developmental stage. But I think you'd have to read the original article. I don't think I can give you more detail than that, I'm afraid.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Paul Crisp from the Centre for the Use of Research on Evidence and Education. I've got two very practical and operational questions. Firstly, how do you hang on to a sample? Why do they do it with the respondents? And secondly, a statement follow-up question, or maybe it's disguised as one. I suspect this is a pretty expensive piece of research. And I see it's got lots of value, but not really targeted value. What's your comment on the kind of value for money of it as a research approach?
Okay, that's a really good question. So, both questions. One is, how do we keep people involved? So we send people a birthday card every year, so that's one way that we keep people involved. And we also send out summaries of findings. So I put some examples at the back. And so, for example, when the 1958 cohort turned 50, we sent them a timeline showing how the research had been used over the years, some of the key findings, but also a bit of fun sort of showing some of the major historical events that had happened. And I was going to end with this slide, but we can look at it now. We did these qualitative interviews with 170 cohort members, and one of the things we asked them at the very end of that was, about being part of the study and what they made of it, and whether they'd thought about dropping out ever. And what came through here was people saying, it's helping everybody, and we're aware that cohort members want to be part of the study if they think it's relevant and it's going to have an impact on quality of people's lives, even if it doesn't have an impact on their own lives. So, that's why I value this sort of event today, because we want to make sure that the studies are policy relevant and can be used by people. So that brings me on to the second of your questions, which is, this is an expensive study, what's its real value? I think it's important to remember with these longitudinal studies that although they're expensive, there's been a huge investment already put in them. So, for example, the teachers and health visitors who all gave up their time for free when the children were developing, when they were 7, 11 and 16, means that we've got a fantastic evidence base. And so the leverage that you get for the extra money that is spent is really excellent. So, the cost of a whole new sweep of a study, because I like figures and I'm not embarrassed to say, is in the region of about £2 million to collect detailed information on 10,000 people. So what's that, about £200 per individual. But the value of that is so much greater because we've got the data on them going through childhood and early adult life. If you started a new study, it would still be the same sort of amount of money, because what you're paying for is to get an interviewer through the door of a cohort member, and to then do sort of an hour's interview. The other thing that we're trying to do to make sure that the data is as valuable as possible is, we asked at age 50, and we've asked the Millennium Cohort children's parents for permission to link to administrative data records. So there are plans to link to the hospital episode statistics for the Millennium Cohort children, and to link to health records and the sort of DWP type administrative data for the older cohort. So that's a way of making sure that we really get best value for money, because again, we can put that data together with the individual data. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
Thank you. I'm Christine Hancock. I work for C3 Collaborating for Health. And I'm bemused by your acronym of NCDs, because in our world it's non-communicable diseases, but more generally known as chronic disease. And we look very much at the risk factors that prevent chronic disease, and particularly tobacco, poor diet and physical activity. And I, in a way, rather than I'd like to ask you very specific questions, but in a more general way, how do people think about using the studies? How do they know what information you collected? In other words, I can think of a whole range of things about what people ate and drank, and how much sport or other physical activity, whether they had cars and so on. But how do we know what information's there in order to design a way of looking at it and using it?
Okay, so there's a number of different ways of answering that. So one is that the data is all archived at the UK Data Archive at the University of Essex, and they have a fantastic website. So if you knew that you wanted to do research on a specific topic, you could go to that website or contact their help desk, and you could say, I really want to look at diet and chronic disease, and it would then pull up for you, like a Google search, which studies, and the cohort studies would come up, and you could then drill down, and without registering to use the data, you can get some very simple tables to tell you how many people there are in different categories, things like self-reported health. So that would be one way of doing it. The other thing is that we run one-day workshops so that somebody who's got quite a sort of developed idea of what they want to do, knows that they want to use the cohort data, but maybe isn't quite sure which variables to use, could come to a one-day workshop, spend the morning finding out about the overall design of the study, and then the afternoon get some hands-on experience of using the data. We're a resource centre, so you've all got a leaflet on your chair, and we do just accept email inquiries from people, and often it's quick and easy for one of our members of staff to sort of do a couple of tables and say, yes, we've got this data, or to direct people to another study. So there are a sort of number of different ways into it. I think these are such large and complicated data sets that it's a bit challenging for anybody who's completely new to it to really access the data in detail. The other thing is, if somebody doesn't have the analytics skills but wants to actually get some research commissioned, then we can also do that. So ways into it. Somebody at the back.
Yeah, I'm Tom Shaw from Longview. Jane, I've got a question for you, but can I just make one point first, which is Neil in his introduction said longitudinal studies are the gold standard. It's very, very encouraging to see the number of people here and how it turned from a round table into this size of audience. Longview exists to promote the use of longitudinal and life course research, working with Jane on that. And I'd just be very glad to hear from anyone at the end who has particular examples, in addition to what Jane has given, of practical applications or potential value of that kind of research. That's sort of, with your permission.
Yes.
The question, a specific question, Jane, going back to the teenage pregnancy. And you said that only, even if you combine it, only predicts 2/3. I want to comment on only in that context.
Yes, well, I was intrigued by this because I read the draft paper that before it went to the Lancet, and I thought, well, actually, you could look at this in two ways, because in a way, 2/3 is a pretty good prediction. But the other side of it is they have put in so many different risk factors that you would expect them to do much better than getting 2/3. And what they've said is, we create a composite score from all this very detailed information we've got from the cohort study. You would expect that the sort of top 10% of those people would be really a high risk of teenage pregnancy, and yet it doesn't quite work like that. And the other point they're making is that using the cohort studies, they can look at a whole range of different information that's available on those individuals, but it wouldn't necessarily be available just sort of routinely. So part of their argument is that if you look at some sort of routine variables, like being in social housing or free school meals, that might be more accessible, then you really don't get a good prediction of teenage pregnancy. But yes, I agree.
Thank you. Francis Listowel, House of Lords. Sorry I was a little delayed. With regard to children in care, how helpful can this approach be? I know the DEMOS approach report out today is very interesting, and in particular the concern about pregnancy rates of young women leaving care. I don't think we've got quite clear enough a picture of what's happening. Will this help? And international comparisons, we talk about how Denmark does and France does. Does this help with our being clearer about whether their approach is better than ours? And sorry, when you're designing future interviews, are there things that you might do which might help us to understand better what's happening with young people leaving care?
Okay, so thinking about children in care, it's obviously going to be a fairly small proportion of the overall cohort. And that's where there's a sort of advantage and disadvantage of this sort of work. And I think this comes to Lee's question at the beginning, really, that it needs to be seen in the context of other research, and it may well be that what would be needed is a longitudinal study that would specifically focus on a sample of children who are leaving care, because you would probably only have a few dozen children out of thousands in the Millennium Cohort study who are in care. I know that people have done some work looking at the older cohorts, and it is possible to identify children who've experienced periods in care, and then the advantage of this sort of work is you can look at much longer term outcomes, but there won't be the detail of questions about that care experience. And so that's where I think this should be seen as a complementary data resource. And so it's very good at providing sort of overall baseline information. It's not so brilliant at looking at small subsections of the population. But the other thing is, as a resource centre, we've got expertise in longitudinal research, so we're happy to advise on people setting up other longitudinal studies that might be more targeted on specific groups, and things like how to stay in touch with people, some of the operational mechanics of it.
Hello. I was wondering whether included in the study you have any sort of ethnographic elements, so that you have some sort of quality check to ensure that what parents are saying they're doing, they are actually doing.
Okay, that's quite a broad question. So there are a number of different sort of more qualitative parts of the data that we've got. So one interesting resource is at age 11, we've got children writing essays about their future life. That was the 1958 study. That doesn't really relate to your question, but it's just an interesting complementary bit of data. There are sort of marginalia from health visitors through children's development. So we've got some comments on sort of family environment, and you'll have seen for the Millennium Cohort study, sorry, it's slow going back. Yeah, here we've got interviewer observations recorded at age 3, age 5 and at age 7. And the other thing that's been very useful is not just having the parents' views of the child's development and behaviour, but having the teachers' measures. And several people who've done modelling on this have found that actually the teacher's measures are a stronger predictor, because the teacher is putting the child in the context of the whole peer group, whereas a mother might have, or a father might have, a very sort of particular view of her own child. So there isn't that much ethnographic information, but there is some triangulated data that can help to some extent. Okay, I think what I'll do is just finish off with a couple more slides, and then we'll just have a few minutes at the end for. So, because I just wanted to highlight that the cohort studies are just one element of the sort of rich resources of longitudinal data that we've got in Britain. So people may well have heard of the British Household Panel Study, which is also, BHPS is the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. We're doing acronyms. And that was a study of 10,000 households, but it's now become 40,000 households with Understanding Society. So that's a new household panel study. And the advantage of that is that rather than focusing on an individual, the idea is to look at every member of the household, including 11 to 16-year-olds. So again, it's a very complementary source of data, because it won't have the sort of early childhood development, because for many people you're just looking at them in adulthood, but it does enable you to look at household change, and probably a bit more about economics as well, because you're able to ask about the finances of both partners. Talked about the birth cohort studies. Then you've got things like the youth cohort study, which has looked more at work to employment transitions. Very large-scale ONS longitudinal study, again a sort of complementary data source. People don't even know whether they're in the ONS longitudinal study or not, because it's about linking together people's census records. So in terms of value for money, it's hugely cost-effective, because you're not actually spending money collecting the data, but you've only got the sort of level of data that's in the census. You can't get the more detailed information. I've mentioned the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, to some extent the missing cohort, children born 1992 to 93. So people looking specifically at adolescents and problems of teenagers, or positive things about teenagers, that would be a good study to look at. People probably know about the Whitehall study, Family and Children study, again sponsored by Department for Work and Pensions. Growing up in Scotland, very similar to the Millennium Cohort study, but with a specific geographic Scottish focus. And I briefly mentioned the English longitudinal study of ageing, which is a spin-off from the Health in England study, and has looked at partners over age 50, so that you can actually trace people as they're going into old age. So I know I've just sort of rattled through those, but what I wanted to make clear was that there's a huge range of longitudinal resources that people might want to access, and I've also provided websites for many of these, and this was the archive website that I was mentioning just now, if you want a starting point to look at all longitudinal data, and we can make these slides available so that people can look more at them. And we've got a whole lot of web resources. I said we organise events and workshops. We've got data dictionaries online, so you can find out what's been in the questionnaires without sort of trading through lots of bits of paper. And this is broadly how you would access the data. So I think I'll leave that as my sort of final slide and just invite a few more comments or questions.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, why don't you have a seat? You're well deserved seat. I think there are a few more questions, so we have a bit more time.
Hi, Mina Dolezal, Officer for Research at Teach First. I'm sure this is probably a question more for the 21st of July, but as they're moving into secondary school and we've got massive changes in the education system, will there be questions on kind of what type of school they are entering into or might be entering into, so that we can track over time if these changes have made any impact?
Absolutely, and then that also relates to what I was saying about linking to administrative data. So we've got things like school census data, so we wouldn't necessarily ask mothers about exactly what type of school the child was going to. We would collect the name of the school so that it can then be linked in with other data.
Sorry, Lee again. It's just a plea for the. I actually think it's very cost effective. I think for the amount of information we get from these cohort studies. But for the 2012 study, it'd be great to have an international element so that you could talk to your colleagues in other countries. Because from a policy perspective, it was touched on earlier. You know, you have policy things happening in other countries, and it's always really interesting. You can compare it between countries or over time. And it would be even more cost effective if you had sort of other countries doing it. And I don't know how feasible that is, but I think it would be good to have that.
Yes, so thank you, because you reminded me I didn't fully answer a question earlier. So the Millennium Cohort study is part of a network of European cohort studies called UConnect. So there's already some very good links with studies. It's interesting that Britain really took the lead with cohort studies, but around the millennium, a lot of different countries thought we ought to have a millennium study to look at children born at the beginning of the new millennium. So we've got links with study in France, links with study in Ireland, there's study based in Rotterdam, so there's quite a lot of different European studies. And I was at a meeting last week which was discussing whether we should be trying to lobby for sort of infrastructure money for a European cohort study. So whether there might actually be something where you weren't just comparing independent cohort studies, but creating a massive international cohort study that would then enable us to make comparisons between places.
Face-to-face interviewing, which is what we seem to be doing, is extremely expensive and getting more expensive, which is why every opinion polling company has now dropped it. When do you think you'll be able to start doing longitudinal surveys online?
Okay, so yeah, very important question. And one of the things that the Understanding Society panel is doing is it has an innovation panel which is enabling us to do more piloting of those sort of mixed mode or different modes of asking questions. For some things we could use online, and for example with the 1958, the last sweep at age 50, we had a debate about whether to do a whole part of it online or whether to use a paper and pencil questionnaire and send it ahead. In the end, we did it paper and pencil, which the cohort members are very used to because they've been in the study for many years, and that was a very cost-effective way of collecting data that was for the whole cohort. But we have to balance that with some of the things that we want to do with the cohort members. So, for example, when we got them to do a memory test, the only real way of being sure that that's being done properly is when you've got an interviewer in the room. The other thing is with the 46 study, and something we'd hope to do with the older, the 58 study, is test sort of physical capability. So there's things like chair raises, where we literally just see how long it takes people to get up and down 5 times, yes? And so that sort of thing, again, you have to do in some way with some sort of physical capacity. But we're very aware of the need to look at different modes of data collection and to make sure things are as cost effective as possible.
Stephen King, GLA Economics. To what extent would the cohorts allow you to do sort of regional analysis? Do you know if there's been many sort of regional studies done over recent years?
Okay, yes, it's absolutely possible to do regional analysis, and so if you're looking at government regions, then that data is just there on the archive, so it's very possible to do that. Clearly you start getting smaller groups of people when you start drilling down to regional level. It's also possible, because we know where all the cohort members live, we've got their postcodes, we can't put that sort of information in the archive because it would be too identifying. But people can make special application to use that data in a safe setting so that we can look at things with a much finer grained geography. I don't think the geographical elements of the studies have been used as much as they could. So there are sort of pockets where there's been an awful lot of research done. So social mobility was mentioned earlier. So there's probably been far more done on social mobility than geographic mobility, for example. But it's a real potential.
Hi, Tim Oates from Cambridge Assessment, part of Cambridge University. I'm not part of the centre, but for years I'm unashamedly plugged the importance of the work which the centre and all of the academics associated with it have been doing. And I think you're entering a kind of new phase, really. For many years it was struggling getting the data into the right kind of shape for systematic analysis, and that was incredibly demanding. People like John Bunner and Tom and Elliott spent huge amounts of time ensuring that was the case. We're now moving into a phase where the data you have is a very mature data set, very rich, capable of very, very sophisticated analysis, and linked in a sophisticated way with policy. And that's going to bring very new challenges to you, and very new mechanisms are going to be needed, I think, by the centre to actually get the dialogue and discourse going between the research community and the policy community. You might like to reflect on what those kind of mechanisms might look like. But within that, there's a problem, and we face it at Cambridge. We work with the qualifications data. We sit on incredibly rich, we interact with government databases. But ethical permissions are actually quite problematic. And many of the things that we as a community would want to do, to be able to test policy assumptions, or to examine policy as it's unfolding in a sense of evaluation, we're running into difficulty with ethical permissions. And it would be helpful if you could just reflect at the moment on whether there are any issues around ethical permissions.
Okay, so perhaps the most applied example of this would be the fact that we were asked cohort members' consent to link to administrative data. And again, I think this is one of the huge advantages of having built up this resource over time, that people have grown to trust us. And so we got very high, sort of 90% of people who were consenting to their data being linked administratively. And we were quite concerned about this because we were going into the field about 6 months after the November 2007 missing data tapes from HMRC. So we thought this might be a really hot issue, but actually our cohort members were very happy to consent to that. So to some extent, we're lucky to have these cohort members who've already given such a lot and are more likely to agree to it. But I think there is also a sort of ethical issue. It is unethical for us to spend lots of money on this data and for it just to sit in ivory towers, just being used to promote academic careers. And that's why I really value being able to talk to a very wide audience like today, and I would sincerely encourage people to get in touch, to register with the CLS website, because the reason the cohort members stay involved is because they think it's making a difference. And as director of the centre, I see that as my mission to make sure that it makes a difference.
What kinds of things is it that you want to do that you raise questions about whether you make permission?
Well, it's linking things through name and through personal characteristics, and quite understandably there are strict limitations on that, but it can create difficulties for certain circumstances as well, and it can be quite attractive actually in that sense.
Dan Baker from Education Charity into University. It's quite a particular question, but have you ever in older cohorts, and do you plan in the Millennium Cohorts to take any data and correlation of sexuality. And in terms of the study of the Millennium Cohort of family units and their correlation with maternity depression and other factors, is there any inclusion within that data of perhaps looked after children and adoptive parents and same-sex parents in that as well?
Okay, very good question. So, for the older cohorts, we have asked people about their relationship histories, and we have asked about the gender of their partner. So, we haven't so much asked a specific question like, are you gay or straight, or for him to define their identity, but you can use the relationship histories to look at people who have had cohabiting same-sex partnerships. Now clearly that's only going to capture people who've actually been cohabiting, and it's been one of those debates about whether we should be asking questions about people's sexuality and how informative that would be, and I think we'll carry on having those debates. Up till now it's not been seen as that productive, and there's been a concern about putting people off by asking questions that are seen as very intrusive. We've got a huge range of data, but we don't ask about people's sex lives, to be honest. We've stayed clear of that. The Millennium Cohort study, similarly, there will be debates as the children go through adolescence. That's a key time for developing identity and how we might tap into that. In terms of their parents, we will have the whole range and it will be representative of the population. So you will have some same-sex couples who've either got an adopted child or whether the child is the bio child of one of the parents. So those groups are included, but they won't be huge numbers within the sample.
Has anyone done anything interesting with those kind of bits of data?
They haven't really, no. I mean, we've reported on it. There's a paper that's fairly recently come out that looks at households and tried to provide a nice descriptive profile of households in the 1970 and the 1958. And in that we included specifically homosexual partnerships because we didn't want to dispose of homosexuality. And it was in the order, with the 58 and the 70, you've got a few dozen people who are cohabiting with the same sex.
Thanks. Paul Crisp again. How do you decide, can you help us understand the process by which you decide how the future suite should be designed and what kind of questions? I should imagine that you're bombarded with people asking you to include thousands of really quite specific things. So can you give us an insight into your process there?
Yes. So we have a scientific committee which is mainly academics but from very different disciplinary backgrounds. So in terms of the governance structure, they advise on the overall trajectory and shape and strategy of the studies. So that's one sort of source of advice. Whenever we're coming to a new sweep, so I'm talking about the Millennium Cohort Study Consultative Conference, we set up working groups. So there would typically be 7 or 8 working groups who would help advise on the content of the next sweep. And that would be organised in terms of topic areas. So there'd be a biomedical group, there'd be an education group, there'd be a sort of family circumstances group. And it is difficult because you have at some point to make the decision as to what gets cut and what goes in. Usually sort of after piloting, we have a much clearer sense of how long interviews are taking and exactly how many minutes we can afford. And then the scientific committee and working groups will also be consulted about how to cut things. But the sort of overriding question has to be about the longitudinal nature of the questions and how valuable they're going to be in the long term, so that we're not looking for quick wins. So something like obesity would be seen as a priority because it's something that you need to understand in a longitudinal framework, and it's clearly a major problem that's not going to go away. Whereas, for example, when we had all the problem about the data being lost and there was a lot in the media about the confidentiality, you might have thought, well, let's ask lots of attitudinal questions within the cohort study about security of data. But that wouldn't be seen as appropriate because that's much more of a sort of one moment problem or issue. So we try to sort of take a long view about developmental issues.
I think we are coming up on the end here. Unless anybody has any comments.
I think you see on that bit there should
the working groups last time, we did try and encourage people. It's about beginning that dialogue, because everyone's busy and it's inviting people to be part of something which they don't necessarily know what they're letting themselves in for. So that's why I want to get out here and make sure people are aware of this, and then we can encourage more people to be part of those groups. But I take your point in terms of scientific committee. Yes, I mean, I was thinking a few weeks ago that we should think about membership. We've got a governing board that includes funders and has got a slightly different perspective. The scientific committee.
Very good. With your question, Jen, we've got some of the slides on our website that will be available on yours too. If you want to get in touch, either email you directly or email us about these kind of things. Fascinating discussion, and we're now learning an incredible amount about all this stuff. There's lots of things we can get our fingers into here. But thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really useful, and I'm sure we'd all like to thank you in the traditional way.